July 1943, late afternoon. The hills near Agira, Sicily. The heat did not feel like weather anymore. It felt like another enemy. It pressed into helmets. It dried mouths. It turned dust into powder, and powder into breath. Every step upward seemed to pull strength out of the men before the German guns even opened. From the ridges above, the defenders could see them coming. Canadian infantry. Small figures moving through stone, scrub and glare. Men from a cold country climbing into a furnace. Men who had crossed an ocean to fight in a landscape most of them had never imagined. The Germans had reason to believe the ground would help them. Sicily was not flat. It was not forgiving. It was a battlefield of ridgelines, villages, narrow roads, dry riverbeds, hidden guns, and sudden fire. Every hill could become a wall. Every village could become a trap. Every bend in the road could be watched by a machine gun. The Canadians were not supposed to move quickly here. They were supposed to slow down. They were supposed to break apart under heat, artillery, and confusion. They should have broken. They did not. Somewhere behind the forward troops, a young Canadian general studied the battle as if it were not a legend, not a song, not a grand patriotic painting, but a problem. His name was Guy Simonds. He did not look like the kind of commander history usually turns into myth. He was not theatrical like Patton. He was not a public symbol like Montgomery. He was not warm in the way soldiers often wanted their commanders to be warm. He was controlled, distant, hard to read. He believed in maps, timing, pressure, preparation, and movement. He believed that war punished sentiment. He believed that if a formation was ordered forward, it had to keep moving, even when the ground itself seemed to resist. To the German defenders in Sicily, he was not yet a famous name. They saw the Canadians first. They saw the dust rising below them. They saw men climbing toward fire. They saw an attacking force that should have slowed under the mountain heat. But behind that force was a commander Montgomery would later judge differently from the rest, not because he was beloved, not because he was easy, not because he made war look heroic, but because, when the battlefield became ugly, Guy Simonds kept looking for a way through, and Sicily was only the first place the enemy would feel it. When people remember the Second World War, they remember the loud names first. Churchill at the microphone, Patton in motion, Eisenhower above the coalition, Montgomery with his beret, his confidence, his carefully built image. Rommel in the desert, Hitler's generals on collapsing maps. But Guy Simonds does not usually stand among them in popular memory. He was Canadian. He was younger than many men who held high command. He was not a great public speaker. He was not a battlefield celebrity. He was not the kind of man who filled a room with warmth, charm, or theatrical energy. And yet, among senior Allied commanders, Simonds developed a reputation that demands attention. Montgomery reportedly regarded him as a Canadian general fit for high command in war. Omar Bradley reportedly called him the best of the Canadian generals. Miles Dempsey reportedly praised him as one of his strongest corps commanders. Those are not small opinions. And they create the central question of this story. What did they see? Because Simonds was not simple. He was admired, but not always loved. He was respected, but not always embraced. He could be brilliant. He could be cold. He could be innovative. He could be ruthless in the demands he placed on formations under his command. That is what makes him interesting. Not the easy myth of a perfect general, not the clean story of a commander who always got everything right, but something darker. A man who fought the war as a series of brutal equations. Terrain, firepower, infantry, armor, time, casualties, pressure. The enemy did not need to know his name to feel the consequences of his decisions. A German soldier in a Sicilian hill town, a gunner south of Caen, a defender watching flooded Dutch ground near the Scheldt. Each of them might only see the Canadians coming. But behind those Canadians, again and again, was a commander trying to turn impossible ground into movement. This story is not about proving that Guy Simonds was flawless. It is about asking why some of the most powerful commanders in the Allied war looked at this quiet Canadian and saw something different. The answer begins in Sicily, it sharpens in Normandy, and it reaches its harshest test in the drowned roads leading to Antwerp. Every army creates its own legends. The Germans remembered commanders who moved fast, struck hard, and built reputations around maneuver, armor, and battlefield audacity. The Soviets became terrifying through scale, through pressure so enormous that German formations could be crushed not by one dramatic attack, but by the weight of an entire front moving forward. The Americans brought industrial power, mobility, air support, trucks, artillery, and a command system that could feed armies across continents. The British brought experience, empire, stubbornness, and generals who understood how to fight inside a coalition. And Canada? Canada's war was often remembered in fragments. Juno Beach, Dieppe, Ortona, the Scheldt. Names known deeply by families, veterans, historians, and regiments, but less loudly by the world. Canadian commanders rarely became global symbols. They did not dominate the popular memory of the war in the same way as Patton, Montgomery, Eisenhower, or Rommel. But that does not mean they were absent from the real machinery of victory. The enemy feared some armies because of numbers. They respected others because of machines. They dreaded air power because it came from above without warning. But the Canadians under Simonds became associated with a different kind of pressure, not glamour, not speed for its own sake, not heroic speeches before the cameras, but method, a cold persistence, the willingness to keep attacking through terrain that looked impossible on a map and worse in real life. In Sicily, that terrain was stone and heat. In Normandy, it was open ground watched by German anti-tank guns. In the Scheldt, it was mud, water, mines, and narrow approaches where every step could be measured in lives. To a German defender, the Canadian soldier in front of him was not a symbol. He was a real man, carrying real fear, moving through real fire. But to the German staff officer staring at a map, Canadian pressure meant something else. It meant another sector had not collapsed. Another attack had not simply vanished. Another formation had been thrown into a brutal job and was still coming. This is where Simonds belongs, not beside the generals remembered for image, but beside the commanders remembered by the problems they solved. The enemy did not need to love his name. History did not need to make him famous. The battlefield only had to reveal what Montgomery thought he saw. A Canadian commander who was different, before Sicily, before Normandy, before the flooded fields of the Scheldt. There was the map, not the battlefield as soldiers felt it, with noise, fear, thirst, and the sudden violence of metal in the air. But the battlefield as a commander had to see it. Lines, roads, ridges, timings, units, fire plans, objectives, distances, casualties. To some men, command was theatre, a voice, a presence, a legend created before the first shot was fired. Guy Simonds was not that kind of man. He did not command like a performer. He commanded like a calculation. He had been shaped by the professional army before the war made him famous. He belonged to that small group of Canadian officers who spent the years before 1939 studying a kind of war most of the country hoped would never come again. The First World War had already shown what modern weapons could do to men in the open: machine guns, artillery, wire, mud, industrial killing. And now, in the Second World War, those same lessons had returned with engines, aircraft, radios, tanks, and faster maps. A commander who relied only on courage would spend men too cheaply. A commander who relied only on machines would misunderstand fear. A commander who relied only on caution might never move at all. Simonds seemed to understand that war punished all three, so he built his reputation on something colder: preparation, control, pressure. He was intelligent, he was disciplined, he was demanding. He rose quickly, and that rise did not come from warmth. It came from the impression that he could handle command, when the situation was complicated and the answer was not obvious. But this came with a cost, because men do not follow maps. Men follow orders, and sometimes the man giving those orders feels very far away. This is the tension at the center of Guy Simonds. He could be respected without being loved. He could be effective without being comforting. He could see the battlefield clearly, while the men inside that battlefield saw only the next wall, the next road, the next burst of fire. That does not make him a villain. It does not make him a hero carved from stone. It makes him something more difficult. A wartime commander, the kind of man whose decisions are judged in miles gained, villages taken, roads opened, and bodies left behind. For the enemy, his personality did not matter. German defenders did not need to know whether Simonds was warm or cold, admired or resented, brilliant or difficult. They only saw the result. Canadian formations kept appearing where the ground should have slowed them. Canadian attacks kept coming after the first shock. Canadian pressure returned after failure, reformed after confusion, and adapted after punishment. That was the beginning of the reputation. Not a speech, not a myth, a pattern, and in Sicily, that pattern would meet its first battlefield test, July 1943, Sicily. To the German defender, the island was not just ground, it was a weapon. The hills did not have to move. The roads did not have to think. The villages did not have to fire a single shot by themselves. They only had to force the attackers into narrow places. A bend in the road, a dry riverbed, a ridge under observation, a stone village with windows looking down onto the approach. Then the guns could do the rest. The Canadians were new to this theatre. They had trained, they had prepared, they had crossed the Atlantic. But training ground and battlefield are never the same thing. In Sicily, every step had weight. The heat struck first, then the dust, then the climb, then the waiting German fire from places that seemed almost invisible until they opened. For the defenders, this was how the attack was supposed to fail. Let the Canadians come up the slope. Let them lose time. Let them lose formation. Let thirst, fear and confusion do their work before the machine guns finished the argument. They should have slowed. They should have scattered. They should have discovered. That courage from a cold country did not survive long in the Sicilian furnace. But they kept coming, not cleanly, not easily, not without fear, and not without cost. They came in the way infantry has always come when the order is given, and the men beside them are still moving. One field, one wall, one road, one ridge, one more village. Guy Simonds commanded the 1st Canadian Infantry Division in this campaign. This was not theory anymore. This was not staff college. This was not a paper exercise with neat arrows and clean assumptions. The enemy was real. The terrain was real. The casualties were real. And the men under his command had to fight through a landscape designed to punish movement. Near places like Aguirre and Regalbuto, the Canadians faced the kind of fighting that does not always become famous outside military history. Hard approaches, defended high ground, enemy positions that had to be reduced one after another. Progress measured not in sweeping breakthroughs, but in small advances paid for by exhaustion. For a commander like Simonds, Sicily was a proving ground. Could he keep a division moving? Could he impose order on heat, terrain, and resistance? Could he take men who were learning battle in real time and force the formation forward without breaking it? The German defenders saw the Canadians from the ridges. Montgomery saw something else. He saw a Canadian commander who could operate under pressure, a young general who did not need warmth to be effective, a man who could read an ugly battlefield and continue the attack. But Sicily was only the first proof. The war would not stay in the mountains. Soon, Simonds would face a different enemy problem, not heat and ridges, not stone villages and narrow Sicilian roads, but the armoured killing grounds of Normandy, open fields, German anti-tank guns, SS formations, dust-to-bombers. Night attacks, and a question far more dangerous than whether Canadians could keep climbing. Could they cross ground the enemy had already turned into a trap? August 1944, south of Caen. The battlefield changed. Sicily had been stone, heat and height. Normandy was steel, dust, hedgerows, villages, armour and open killing ground. Here the German defender did not need a mountain. He needed a field of fire, a road under observation, a hidden anti-tank gun, a village edge, a tank waiting behind cover. A line on a map where the Canadians would have to come forward because there was no other way to reach the ground beyond. South of Caen, the German army had been battered, but it was not helpless. Its formations had been bombed, its supply lines had been strained. Its soldiers had endured weeks of Allied firepower. But the defenders still knew how to kill. They knew how to wait. They knew how to let armour come into range. They knew how to turn a village into a fortress and a road into a grave. For Canadian infantry and tanks, this was a different kind of fear. In Sicily, the danger was climbing toward an enemy above you. In Normandy, the danger was crossing open ground while the enemy watched you come. A man could feel naked in a field like that, even inside an army, even with artillery behind him, even with tanks nearby. Because once the firing started, the battlefield became very small. The next ditch, the next hedge, the next shell hole, the next scream. To the Germans, this was where the Canadians could be stopped. Let them attack. Let them move into the open. Let their infantry separate from their armour. Let confusion enter the columns. Let the anti-tank guns wait until the shapes became clear through smoke and dust. This was the expectation. The Canadians had courage, but courage did not stop an 88mm shell. Courage did not make a man bulletproof. Courage did not prevent a battalion from losing direction in darkness, smoke and fire. If the Canadians attacked in the old way, they could be bled in the old way. Guy Simonds understood the problem. He now commanded the 2nd Canadian Corps. And the task before him was not simply to attack harder. Attacking harder was not enough. More bravery was not enough. More speeches were not enough. The battlefield itself had to be altered. The infantry had to reach the enemy with some protection. The armour had to move with them. Darkness had to become cover. Bombers had to become shock. Artillery had to become a wall. Machines built for one purpose might have to be torn apart and remade for another. The German defenders expected exposed men. Simonds began looking for a way to send them forward inside armour, not because war had become cleaner, not because the plan would be perfect, but because in Normandy, to keep moving through the killing ground, the Canadians would need more than courage. They would need adaptation, and adaptation would come at night, before the machines moved, before the night attack, before the maps were redrawn with arrows pointing south from Caen. There were men waiting beside roads in Normandy, Canadian infantrymen, some silent, some smoking, some checking the same equipment again and again because their hands needed something to do, some trying not to look at the open ground ahead. On a map, infantry can look simple, a block, a line, a unit symbol, a battalion moving from one phase line to another. But inside that symbol were men who could feel fear before the first shot was fired, men who had already seen what German guns could do, men who knew that a field in Normandy could look empty and still be watched by death. For a commander, the problem was tactical. How do you move infantry forward without losing them before they reach the objective? How do you keep armor and infantry together? How do you break through a defensive belt when the enemy expects you? But for the men waiting below the map, the problem was not tactical. It was personal. Would they make it across? Would the tank beside them burn? Would the man next to them still be there after the first shell landed? Would the darkness protect them or swallow them? This is where the story of Guy Simonds becomes more complicated. Because innovation in war is often remembered as brilliance, a new method, a new machine, a new plan, but every innovation begins with a failure that has already hurt real men. The Kangaroo did not appear because war was clean. It appeared because infantry in the open were vulnerable, too vulnerable, exposed to machine guns, exposed to mortars, exposed to shell splinters, exposed to the sudden, helpless distance between courage and survival. The Germans understood that vulnerability. They had built their defense around it. Let the infantry move forward, separate them from their tanks, catch them in the open, pin them down, break their rhythm, make the attack slow, make it bleed, make it fail. Simonds understood it too, and this is the moral weight of command. A cold commander can be dangerous because he sees men as pieces on a board. But a cold commander can also be necessary when emotion alone cannot solve the killing ground. The truth is harder than either myth. Simonds was not sending symbols forward. He was sending men. Men with names, men with homes, men with fear in their stomachs and sweat under their helmets. Men who may never have cared about Montgomery's opinion, Bradley's judgment, or the reputation of Canadian command. They cared about surviving the next field, the next village, the next hour. So when Simonds looked for a new way to move infantry forward, the question was not only how to defeat the Germans, it was how to keep the attack alive, without feeding men into the same exposed ground, in the same exposed way. The answer would come from machines that had not been built for this purpose. Priest self-propelled guns, armored vehicles designed to carry weapons. Now stripped, changed, emptied, reborn into something different, not glamorous, not elegant, not perfect, but useful. A steel box with tracks, a rough shelter, against bullets and fragments, a way to carry infantry forward through a battlefield that wanted them dead before they arrived. The men who climbed inside would not become invincible. Armor could burn, shells could still kill, confusion could still scatter units in darkness, plans could still fail. But to the German defender waiting in Normandy, one expectation was about to change. The next Canadian infantry attack would not look like the last one. The men would not simply walk into the killing ground. This time, they would come forward inside armor, and the night would move with them. August 7th, 1944, night south of Caen. The German line waited in darkness. The defenders knew the ground, they knew the roads, they knew where Allied armor was likely to come. They knew that Canadian attacks had courage. But courage still had to cross open fields, and open fields could be killed. Then the sky began to change. Bombers passed overhead. Artillery opened. The night flashed white, then orange, then black again. Dust rose, smoke spread, engines turned over in the dark, and somewhere in that noise, the German defender, listening from his position, began to hear something that did not feel like the usual rhythm of an infantry. Attack, tracks, armor, engines, more engines. Not one tank, not a few. vehicles.columns. The attack was called Operation Totalize, and it carried the mark of Guy Simonds. It was not just an order to advance, it was an attempt to redesign the way an advance could happen. The plan used darkness, it used heavy firepower, it used bombing, it used artillery, it used armor, and, most importantly, it used a rough, improvised answer to the infantry problem. The Kangaroo, converted from priest self-propelled guns, these vehicles were stripped of their main armament and turned into armored carriers for infantry. They were not beautiful machines. They were not designed from the beginning as perfect troop carriers. They were battlefield improvisations, the kind of thing war produces when the old method has become too expensive, and the next attack cannot wait for a perfect solution. To the men inside, the Kangaroo was not a miracle. It was heat, metal, noise, fear, a hard ride through darkness while shells and engines shook the air, but it gave them something they had often lacked in the open: a layer of protection, a chance to arrive closer to the enemy before stepping out into fire. For the German defenders, this changed the expectation. They had prepared to punish infantry crossing exposed ground, but now the infantry was moving with armor, hidden by darkness, covered by fire, carried forward inside steel. The battlefield did not become safe. Nothing about Normandy was safe, but it became different, and difference matters in war, because a defender who expects one kind of attack can be shaken by another. A gunner waiting for silhouettes in the open may suddenly hear vehicles much closer than expected. Strong point expecting exposed infantry may find men dismounting from armored carriers. After the first shock has already passed over it, a defensive system built around killing men before they arrive may begin to fail. When the men arrive under armor, Operation Totalize achieved surprise and progress in its opening phase. But it was not a clean legend. It did not become a perfect breakthrough. The later stages became confused. The Germans resisted. Units lost direction. Bombing and movement created chaos. Men still died. Vehicles were still hit. Commanders still struggled to control the battle once the neat lines on the map entered smoke. Darkness and fear, that matters. Because the purpose of this story is not to pretend Simonds solved war. No commander solved war. No machine made infantry safe. No plan survived untouched. But Totalize showed something important about the Canadian general Montgomery had noticed. Simonds was willing to change the method, not simply ask men to be braver, not simply repeat the same attack and hope courage would overcome firepower. He looked at the German defense and asked how to alter the conditions of the fight. If the enemy expected infantry in the open, then infantry would move inside armor. If the enemy expected daylight visibility, then the attack would come at night. If the enemy expected a normal rhythm, then the rhythm would be broken by bombers, artillery, vehicles, and darkness. This was why the Kangaroo became more than a vehicle. It became a symbol of Canadian adaptation under pressure. Symbol of infantry vulnerability, a symbol of Simonds' cold imagination. Take a machine built to carry a gun. Remove the gun. Put men inside. Send them forward through the fire. There is nothing romantic about that, but there is something revealing, because in that rough armored carrier, you can see the entire problem of Simonds' war. The map required movement, the enemy required force, the soldiers required protection, and time allowed no perfect answer. So the Canadians improvised, and the Germans, waiting in Normandy's darkness, had to face an attack that did not arrive the way they expected. They could still fight it. They could still delay it. They could still kill, But they could no longer assume the Canadians would come forward in the old way. Normandy had forced Simonds to innovate, but the worst terrain was still ahead. Not dry fields. Not dust. Not night armor moving south from Cayenne water, mud, mines, causeways, and a port the Allies desperately needed. September 1944 Antwerp had fallen on a map. It looked like victory, a great port, a gateway into Europe. A solution to the Allied supply problem. But war is not won by names on maps. A port is not useful because it has been captured. A port is useful only when ships can reach it. And the sea road to Antwerp still passed through the Scheldt. The Germans knew it, the Allies knew it, and soon the Canadians would know it in mud, water, blood, and exhaustion. To the German defender, the Scheldt was a gift, not a gift of comfort, a gift of delay. Flooded fields, canals, dikes, causeways, mines, mud, flat ground where movement could be seen, narrow approaches, where men and vehicles could be forced into predictable lines. This was not the dramatic battlefield of open maneuver. This was a drowned trap, a place where the defender did not need to destroy every attacker immediately. He only had to slow them, hold a crossing, break a road, keep artillery falling, force the Canadians to come forward through waterlogged ground where every step took strength and every pause invited fire. For the Canadians, the Scheldt was one of the war's hard necessities. It did not have the instant symbolic power of D-Day. It did not have the same public memory as Juno Beach. It did not look, from a distance, like the moment history would choose to remember first. But without clearing the approaches to Antwerp, the great port could not fully serve the Allied advance. The war in northwest Europe needed supplies. Armies needed fuel. Guns needed shells. Men needed food. Trucks needed roads. And all of that depended, in part, on opening a route through ground the Germans were determined to defend. During this period, with General Crerar ill, Guy Simonds temporarily commanded 1st Canadian Army. The cold commander was now facing one of the coldest battlefields, not cold only in temperature, cold in logic, cold in necessity, cold in the way it reduced human beings to movement through mud, because the map demanded Antwerp. From the German side, the expectation was clear. The Canadians could be made to pay, flood the land, hold the dikes, mine the roads, defend the villages, use artillery, use machine guns, use every canal as a barrier, and every dry route as a killing lane. The Canadians had fought in Sicily, they had fought in Italy, they had fought in Normandy. They were tired. Their infantry had already carried too much. Surely, in a place like this, pressure could become exhaustion. Exhaustion could become hesitation. Hesitation could become delay, and delay was exactly what Germany needed. But the Canadians came forward again, not quickly, not cleanly, not without mistakes, not without suffering. They came through the kind of ground that made every advance feel unnatural, across canals, along roads under observation, through villages that had to be cleared, toward German positions that understood the value of every hour they could hold. This was not a battlefield built for legends. It was a battlefield built for endurance. And that is why it matters. Because if Sicily showed that Simonds could command under heat and height, and Normandy showed that he could adapt under armored fire, the Scheldt showed what happened when the problem became almost cruel in its simplicity. The enemy holds the water road. The port must open. The Canadians must clear it. For the German defender, the question was whether Canada could be slowed long enough to matter. For the Canadian soldier, the question was whether the next step would be into mud, water, or fire. And for Guy Simonds, looking again at the map, the question was the same one that had followed him since Sicily. How do you move men through ground that seems designed to stop them? By the autumn of 1944, the German army in the west was no longer fighting the war it had expected to fight. It had been pushed out of much of France. It had lost ground in Normandy. Its formations had been battered by aircraft, artillery, fuel shortages, and the constant pressure of Allied armies moving east, but retreat did not mean surrender, and defeat did not mean silence. The German army still knew how to defend. It still knew how to make ground expensive. It still knew how to turn rivers, villages, dikes, and roads into obstacles that could bleed an attacker for every mile. This is where the phrase enemy realization must be handled carefully. There may not be one perfect German quote that says, "We feared Guy Simonds." There may not be one dramatic diary entry where a German commander writes his name with trembling hands. War is rarely that clean. The enemy. Realization was not always a sentence. Sometimes it was a defensive order, a blown bridge, a flooded field, a reinforced strongpoint, a counterattack at the exact place where delay mattered most. Sometimes the enemy's respect is not found in what he says. It is found in what he chooses to defend. In Normandy, German defenders had already felt Canadian pressure south of Caen. They had seen that Canadian formations under Simonds were not simply repeating the same method. They had seen night movement, massed, fire armor, bombers, improvised, troop carriers, infantry arriving in ways the defenders had not fully expected. The Germans could still resist. They could still kill. They could still break up attacks and punish mistakes. But they could not ignore what was happening in front of them. The Canadians were learning. The method was changing. The battlefield was changing. With it, then came the Scheldt. And here, the German realization became strategic. Antwerp mattered. If the Allies opened the port, their supply problem in northwest Europe would change dramatically. Fuel, shells, food, vehicles, replacements, the blood and breath of armies could move closer to the front. So the Germans held the approaches, not because the land was glorious, not because the flooded fields were worth dying for in themselves, but because delay had value. Every day the Scheldt remained blocked was another day Antwerp could not fully serve the Allied advance. Every canal defended, every causeway mined, every village held, every artillery barrage fired into the mud, all of it was part of the same grim calculation. Make the Canadians pay. Make them slow down. Make the port stay closed as long as possible. If a famous enemy witness is needed for this part of the story, it must be chosen carefully. In Normandy, Kurt Meyer of the 12th SS Panzer Division can appear as a lens into German and Waffen-SS opposition to Canadian forces. But any use of his memoirs or claims must be treated with caution. He was not a neutral witness. He was part of the Waffen-SS. His post-war memory was shaped by self-defense, reputation, and ideology, so he should not be allowed to narrate the truth of the battle unchecked. In the Scheldt, a broader German perspective may be stronger. German 15th Army commanders and staff officers responsible for holding the approaches, the defensive pattern itself. But even without a single perfect quote, the evidence of resistance speaks. The Germans defended because they understood what was at stake. They did not have to admire the Canadians to recognize the danger. They did not have to know Simonds personally to feel the pressure of his army-level command. They did not have to call him different. They only had to react as if the sector mattered, and they did. This is the enemy realization at the heart of the story. Not panic, not legend, not some clean cinematic confession. Something more believable. Frustration, recognition. The slow understanding that these Canadian formations could be delayed, punished, and exhausted, but not simply dismissed. In Sicily, the Germans had terrain. In Normandy, they had anti-tank fire and armoured defences. In the Scheldt, they had water, mines, mud, and time. Each battlefield gave them reasons to believe the Canadians could be stopped. And each battlefield forced a different answer. They should have broken. They did not. They should have stopped after the first shock. They did not. They should have lost momentum in mud, darkness, and flooded roads. They did not. For the German defender, this was the most unsettling kind of enemy, not invincible, not unstoppable, not mythical, but persistent, a force that could be hurt and still return, a formation that could lose men and still reorganize, a commander whose plans could be disrupted, but whose pressure did not disappear. That is why Simonds could be delayed, but not ignored. So why did Montgomery notice him? Why did Allied commanders remember Guy Simonds as something more than another capable officer in a vast war? The answer is not found in one perfect battle. It is not found in one clean victory. It is not found in a single heroic moment where everything worked exactly as planned. That was not Simonds' war. His reputation was built in places where the answer was ugly. Sicily showed the first proof. A Canadian division under heat, dust, and German defensive terrain. A young commander learning and proving himself in real battle. Villages like Agira and Regalbuto were not famous to the world in the way Stalingrad or El Alamein were famous, but they mattered. They showed whether a formation could move when movement was hard. They showed whether command could survive confusion. They showed whether Canadian soldiers far from home could fight through a Mediterranean battlefield that punished every step. The Germans expected the terrain to help break them. It did not. Normandy showed the second proof. There, courage alone was not enough. The German defences south of Caen were too dangerous for simple bravery to solve. Open ground, anti-tank guns, armour, villages, turned into defensive positions, smoke, and dust and confusion. The enemy expected Canadian infantry to be exposed. Simonds answered with adaptation, not perfect adaptation, not painless adaptation, but adaptation. Night attack, bombers, artillery, armoured, columns, the Kangaroos, a rough, improvised answer to a brutal question. How do you move men through fire without asking them to walk naked into the killing ground? The Kangaroo did not make war clean. It did not make men safe. It did not guarantee success, but it revealed the mind. Behind the plan, Simonds was not simply asking for more courage. He was changing the battlefield conditions. That is what commanders are supposed to do, and that is why commanders are judged. Differently from the men who carry rifles, the infantryman is asked to endure the impossible. The commander is judged by whether he made the impossible slightly less murderous, or whether he simply spent men until the objective was taken. Simonds lived inside that judgment. He was respected because he could solve problems. He was criticized because those solutions still cost lives. Both things can be true. Then came the Scheldt, the final proof in this story, the flooded road to Antwerp, a battle that did not look glamorous from far away, but carried enormous strategic weight. The German defenders understood the value of delay. They used water, mines, roads, artillery, and every defensive advantage the landscape offered. The Canadians and their Allied partners had to clear the approaches, not because it made a beautiful story, because the armies needed the port. This was the coldest logic of war. Men in mud so ships could move, canals crossed so trucks could roll, villages cleared so fuel could reach the front. Human cost paid for a logistical necessity. And during this period, Simonds temporarily commanded 1st Canadian Army while General Quérard was ill. This matters, because it places him not only at the level of tactical innovation, but at the level of operational necessity. He was no longer only the commander behind one attack. He was part of the command pressure behind one of Canada's most difficult and important campaigns in northwest Europe. The Scheldt did not make him beloved. It did not turn him into a simple hero. If anything, it makes the question harder. What kind of commander keeps pushing when the ground is flooded? What kind of commander looks at mud, mines, exhaustion and casualties, and still sees the port that must open? What kind of man can carry that responsibility without becoming either sentimental or monstrous? That is why Montgomery's judgment matters, not because Montgomery was always right, not because every opinion from a famous general becomes truth, but because Montgomery understood the brutal language of command. He had seen men who looked impressive and failed. He had seen men who spoke confidently and could not manage battle. He had seen commanders who inspired, commanders who hesitated, commanders who blamed, and commanders who broke under pressure. In Simonds, he saw something else. Canadian officer who could handle complexity, a commander who could force movement through hostile ground, a man who could be cold enough to keep thinking when the battlefield became emotionally unbearable. That coldness is not automatically noble. But in war, it can become useful. Terribly useful. This is the final proof, not that Guy Simonds was perfect, he was not. Not that his plans always worked, they did not. Not that the men under him paid no price, they paid heavily. The proof is that across Sicily, Normandy and the Scheldt, a pattern emerged. When the enemy expected terrain to stop the Canadians, they kept moving. When the enemy expected exposed infantry, Simonds looked for armor. When the enemy expected flooded ground to buy time, Canadian pressure continued. And when senior Allied commanders looked at the man behind that pattern, they saw why he was different. Not warmer, not louder, not more famous. Different. After the war, the world remembered the names it had already learned to recognize. Churchill, Eisenhower, Montgomery, Patton, Rommel. Names attached to speeches, photographs, memoirs, arguments, legends and myths. Guy Simonds did not become that kind of name. He did not give history an easy image. He was not the smiling liberator, not the dramatic cavalryman, not the national prophet, not the general who made war feel grand from a distance. He was harder to use that way, too cold, too technical, too uncomfortable, too connected to the kind of fighting where victory does not look like glory, but like men moving one more mile through dust, smoke, or water. But Canada's war was never only the part that became easy to remember. It was not only beaches and flags, not only speeches and parades, not only the bright moments when history pauses and says, "Here, remember this." Canada's war was also Sicily, men climbing in heat toward German guns. It was Normandy, infantry waiting beside steel vehicles in the dark, while artillery shook the fields south of Caen. It was the Scheldt boots sinking into mud, water on both sides, mines under roads, a port on the map that had to open, no matter how far away it felt to the men carrying rifles. And through those places runs the difficult story of Guy Simonds, a commander praised by famous men, but not easily loved. A general who saw war as a problem of movement, firepower, timing, and pressure. A Canadian who did not become globally famous like Montgomery or Patton, but whose decisions shaped some of Canada's hardest fighting. He was not a superhero. He was not flawless. He was not gentle enough to become comforting, and maybe that is why his story matters. Because real command in war is not comforting. It is the burden of giving orders other men must carry out. It is the burden of looking at a map and knowing that every arrow means fear, every objective means casualties, every delay means consequences, every success has a price hidden inside it. The Kangaroo returns here as more than a machine, a stripped-down gun carrier turned into a shelter for infantry, rough Canadian answer to a German killing ground. Symbol of Simonds himself, not beautiful, not perfect, not romantic, but practical, hard, born from necessity, built because the old way was too costly and the next attack could not wait. Inside, those steel walls were the real center of the story, not the general, not Montgomery's opinion, not the map. The men, the soldiers who climbed in, the soldiers who stepped out, the soldiers who crossed the fields, canals, villages, and roads that made the reputation possible. That is the truth behind the title. Montgomery noticed Simonds because Simonds could command when the battlefield became ugly, but the battlefield became ugly for the men below him first. The enemy felt pressure. The Allies saw competence. History recorded a reputation, but the soldiers carried the weight, and somewhere between Sicily's stones, Normandy's smoke and the Scheldt's black water, the enemy learned that this Canadian commander was different, not because he made war heroic, but because when war became mud, steel, fire, and impossible ground, Guy Simonds kept looking for a way through.